So everything in today's lesson and much of what will be next week's lesson is all from this book. So I'm not smart enough to have kind of the cultural commentary that I'm going to be presenting today. Most all of this outline is from this book, chapters 1 through 7. This book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's listed on the second page at the bottom of your notes. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And it's a pretty detailed book. There's a shorter version of that book that has come out recently called Strange New World. It would be European, right, developed, and American, developed country. That is not what we're talking about. A first world, he would be thinking in terms of development. That would be a pagan culture. So think of Greek and Roman cultures, okay? Pagan, worshiping, idolatry, but developing, especially the Greek and the pagans, they developed a pretty significant moral code around their mythology. So a first world culture or a pagan culture, their moral authority is transcendent. They have gods, right? And those gods have authority over them. And this emphasizes fate and mythology. So they had a whole mythology around their pantheon of gods, right? And you had to kind of submit to fate. If you were born a slave, you were just going to be a slave. If you were born the emperor, you were going to be the emperor, okay? Second world would be more or less religious cultures. So we would think of modern Europe, modern America, 100 years ago maybe, okay? Right, so a more or less religious culture. Their moral authority is also transcendent. So Muslims also, Islam would be included in this, right? They have a God, and so the God says what is right and wrong. Our God, the Lord, the God of the Bible, says what is right and wrong. So moral authority is still transcendent from above, but this emphasizes faith, right? Belief in God, not fate, just accepting, your lot in life, and revelation. So for Christianity, it would be the Bible. For Islam, it would be the Quran, right? So it emphasizes revelation. So you follow me so far? Okay. These cultures tend to be stable cultures, right? The Roman Empire lasted a long time. European culture has lasted a long time, right? Even outlasted its sort of Christian faith, right? American culture is lasting and is outlasting its Christian faith. These cultures tend to be stable because they're grounded in morality, and that morality is something outside of themselves. Okay? A third world, I'm sort of calling that a post-religious culture. It could also be a post-pagan culture. But the moral authority is internal, right? It's just whatever I think is right. And the foundations for moral authority are not sacred, so they change. So we're watching this happen left and right, in America and in European society. Moral authority is internal. The foundations for morality become individual and therapeutic. What makes me feel good? What makes me feel like, you hear this, my authentic self, right? So what makes me sort of feel right? So therapeutic and individual. This philosopher, Philip Reeve, called this psychological man, right? Psychological man. In other words, the most important part about this person is their psychology, their internal thoughts and emotions. This is a quote from Carl Trueman. The only moral criterion that can be applied to behavior in this third world setting is whether it conduces to, and he's using some big language, I don't use the word conduce, but if it produces feelings of well-being in the individuals concerned. Ethics, therefore, becomes a function of feeling. Right. If it feels so right, how can it be so wrong? Right. That's a really old song, right? But that's this. All right. Now, what is confusing is we tend, and maybe his labels weren't the best, but we think of third world countries, right? And we think of them as cohesive, right? In this old way of using first, second, third world. You follow me? A third world country they're poor, they're all poor, right? There's corruption, there's a lot of corruption. We think of those things. But what can be confusing is these cultural perspectives are completely incompatible, but they can all exist in the same society. Right? So right now, what we have in America is a mixture of a religious culture, right, which we are a part of, a religious culture, and a post-religious culture. Right? We have a mixture of that, and that's the reason that our public discourse feels like a battleground so much. And you can listen to the politicians that talk about civil discourse, but it's just not going to happen because the country, and this is true, less true in Europe because they're more taken over completely by this third post-religious culture, right? But as long as there's a mixture of the religious and post-religious cultures, it's just not gonna, there's not gonna be a lot of civil discourse because we're looking at morality in ways that are literally worlds apart. Is that right? So you see, that's the reason he's saying first, second, and third world. These are worlds apart from one another. And so that discourse is difficult in a country like ours because you are worlds apart in your perspective on life and morality. All right? Now, let me move on. Third world cultures lead to two things, emotivism and deconstruction. And again, you have to understand, I learned all this stuff. I didn't make this stuff up. I'm not smart enough to make this stuff up, okay? I'm just passing some of this on to help all of us understand the world that we live in, right? So it leads to emotivism. Emotivism is this term for when moral judgments are nothing more than expressions of personal preference. Moral judgments, what's right for you might not be right for me. What's right for me might not be right for you. Well, that's okay if you're choosing between a white-collar and a blue-collar job, right? But when it comes to genuine ethical choices, that is difficult to make work. It's very much in violation of the Scriptures, right? Okay, that's not what we get from the Bible. That's what you get from a post-religious perspective. But emotivism, and here's where you hear this. So moral judgments, saying that something is right or wrong, is in this culture seen as a power play, like you're just trying to exert your power over me, and at worst it's seen as violence. So you don't have to lynch. I'm just using some over-the-top expressions here, okay? So I'm not recommending this, right? You don't have to lynch a homosexual to exert violence against them in this world. You just have to say that homosexuality is wrong. That is considered emotional violence. Does that make sense? Right? That's this whole, if emotions is in me feeling good or someone feeling good about themselves, for you to say that their lifestyle is wrong, you're making them feel bad, and that is considered violence. All right, so that's emotivism. Also, how many phobias do we have to have, right? A few years ago, we just had homophobia, but now we have transphobia. And, pretty soon we're going to have fuzzy phobia, and, because that's the name for somebody who identifies as an animal, right? You're a fuzzy. A furry, sorry, furry, yeah. Yeah, you can tell them how much I know. I'm not really steeped in this, right? Yeah. Well, pretty soon it's going to be fuzzy phobia, too. People with beards. All right, so all these different phobias. So what does that say? If I say that homosexuality or transgender identity is wrong, they're saying that I have a serious problem of fear, right? That I'm basically a neurotic bigot if I say those things. So what kind of light does that? They're progressive and open and accepting of other people, but I am a neurotic bigot for saying that something is wrong. So, of course, that style of moral judgment does not come under the same they're not considering how that might make me feel to be told that I'm homophobic. Frankly, I'm not afraid of homosexuals. But for me to say that it's sin, they are allowed to spend the language, right, to make me look, or you look, neurotic and bigoted. All right? And in a country that has had a lot of ethnic tension, right, and slavery of all things, right, you don't want to be a bigot, right, because bigotry is Southern Jim Crow laws, right? The association of bigotry is really, really bad. All right. And then deconstruction. We could go into a lot of that. You hear about people deconstructing their faith a lot these days. But essentially, beyond even people who grew up and or previously embraced Christianity, deconstructing their faith, these third world cultures, these post-religious cultures, tear down moral codes without replacing them with anything but psychological feelings, right? So they tear down moral codes but don't replace them with anything. So they are by definition unstable cultures. So next week we'll talk about this. This can't last. It's self-destructive. All right. We do need to move on, but are there any comments or questions quickly? All right, so how did we get here? So we're going to go all the way back to the 1700s. We're going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That's my own personal pronunciation. I looked it up on Google how to pronounce that, and it wasn't quite that way, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote a book called Rousseau's Confessions. Does anybody else know about a famous author who wrote a book called The Confessions? St. Augustine. All right, so he is doing self-biography, which is what Augustine did, but he is in many ways attacking Augustine by making this the title of his book. Okay? In Augustine's book, he tells about stealing some pears, and he's making a confession. He and his friends stole pears for the fun of it. They weren't hungry. They didn't need the pears. They did it for the fun of it. And he assigns the responsibility to his own sin nature. Rousseau stole some asparagus, but because he stole it for a friend, for the sake of the friendship, he sees it as a good act. Okay? So he is directly attacking Augustine's interpretation of sin, right? And this kind of is because he believed that people are born innocent and that society corrupts us. So it is the speed limit that makes you want to drive dangerously. So it is society, and that if we didn't have laws and sort of the idea of civility, right? If we didn't have those things, then we would just be pure and innocent, and we'd pretty much do okay together if we didn't have sort of societal restrictions, what sometimes is referred to as mores, right? Sort of group understanding of moral character, right? So, starting off pretty bad there. Here are some of his primary philosophical ideas. Civilization is the source of all social ills. Things like marriage laws, right? You have to have the state says you have to have a marriage license. Or society says you have to have an authority figure solemnize your vows. You know, whether that's a preacher or the captain of the boat, right? That's just a mess. That's a problem. That's not a solution. That's a source. It's not a solution to a problem. It's a source of a problem. So children and individuals in their natural state, they are basically pure. I want to say, what was the result of that? By the way, if you couldn't tell by his name, he's French. The result of that philosophy led towards the French Revolution. Throw off all authority, all societal norms, throw it all away. That led directly to the French Revolution. All right. Also, he promoted the idea that ethics are a function of empathy. Ethics are a function of empathy. If I myself had those feelings, for example, homosexual feelings, how would I want to be treated? Okay? So, does that make sense? That empathy is the source of all ethics. So, how would I want to be treated if I was in that person's position? Okay? And so, you want to be allowed to be married, maybe. And so, we should allow homosexual marriage. So he is promoting this idea that ethics are the function of empathy. There's some truth to that, right? If you're in a car accident on the side of the road and you're bleeding out, how would you like to be treated? You would like for another motorist to stop and help you. Right? So there's some truth to that, but it also internalizes all morality. So all morality now is internal. And you can redefine it any way you want to. Right? So you could say something like this, well, if I had those homosexual feelings, I would like for somebody to be honest with me and tell me that there's something against nature about that. And so you can kind of say anything you want to because now all moral decisions have been internalized. Does that make sense? Right? If it's all empathy, you can almost say anything. This innocence and the value of the innocence of the young and the value of this idea of the state of nature has led to, in our day and age, a cult of youth, right? If the young are born innocent and society is responsible for corrupting us all, then youth and youthfulness will be elevated, and consequently you get Greta Thunberg, right? Does anybody know who Greta Thunberg is? She's that, oh, wait a minute. I'm about to say something I shouldn't. She's that loudmouth young waif that made the "How dare you" speech at the UN Climate Action Summit. And I mean, she was so volatile in the way she spoke. How dare you, drive cars that burn gasoline. She was speaking about climate. She's a climate activist. And she sailed here. She rode on a sailboat so that she wouldn't be burning any fossil fuels in an airplane to get here, because she's from Sweden, I think, or Norway. And she spoke in New York. So, give her credit for not flying in an airplane. But nevertheless, she was true to her. She wasn't a hypocrite. Just this, she was about 17, I think. And, she is also susceptible to the problem I've been talking about in some of our sermons. She was 16 and thought she knew everything. Been getting dumber ever since. Right? We all have that. When we are that young, we know very little but think we know a lot. And that was true for her too. Anyway, but she was nominated 5 times for a Nobel Peace Prize. Every year she gets nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And she was the Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2019. So all of that philosophy leads to this elevation of youth. On top of that, just so that you know, Rousseau sent all 5 of his children who were in a state of innocence to an orphanage as soon as they were born. I'm not sure if that was a result of his selfishness or if he really thought they would be better off without him. For the sake of the tape, Robin said, that might have been true. I have never read any research on the results of that on his children, but I can't imagine. Just can't imagine. Yeah, so either he would either see that as protecting them from the family culture, or he was compromising his own principles and giving them over to the culture. Yes. All right, we got to keep moving. This guy, Percy Shelley, I think there were two of them, so everybody uses his middle name. I have no idea how to say it. He was not from France. He was from England. And he talked about something called the unacknowledged legislators. We'll get to that in a second. He was a romantic poet. He lived a very immoral life and encouraged his wife to also live a very immoral life. He kind of came up with this idea that poetry appeals to the heart, therefore, and not just poetry, but especially in our day and age, novels, stories, movies, music, okay? Pop culture. It appeals to the heart, and therefore that is the most effective method for both personal and political change. All right, so you're probably more affected by the stories that you like than you are by the philosophy that's being taught in the halls of the ivory tower Ivy League colleges, right? We're probably all more affected by the stories that we like, movies that we watch, the music that we hear, than sort of the high and mighty philosophical ideas. And that's why he said in this essay he wrote, Defense of Poetry, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Let me move quickly here. He attacked institutional religion because institutional religion polices behavior, and he thought everybody should be free to live based on their feelings only and personal fulfillment. He promoted a sexual liberation as a means toward political liberation. By the way, that is very, very, very strong in both, in the transgender movement today. That the sexual revolution must necessarily lead to a political revolution. In this lengthy narrative poem called Queen Mab, he said this: love withers under constraint. Its very essence is liberty. And let me tell you, he lived that way, right? He was totally uncommitted to any commitments of monogamy. And one of his lovers committed suicide. His wife was depressed most of the time, as you might expect. He promoted this revolution because he thought really, he's building on Thoreau, by the way. He really felt like you had to have no restrictions for there to be authenticity, right? For humans to be real, there had to be no restrictions placed on them. It seems like to me, so here's a little bit of my response. It seems like to me that the elevation of childhood has become, in this, very anti-child, right? Because by definition, children restrain you, right? Children, you have a few kids, and life is different than when you were, a free bachelor in life, right? And so that's kind of a strange twist. This leads me to this idea that I want to introduce. It's called the social imaginary. Charles Taylor, who's still alive, born in 1931, he came up with this phrase and this idea of the social imaginary. And he's pointing out that there needs to be something more than ideas to influence the world. As individuals, we tend to imagine the world in a certain way through other things than just ideas, right? We like stories. We have emotions. We watch movies. We have relationships with other people. And so what becomes more influential than just a worldview, right? Most of us, by the way, espouse a philosophy called Scottish common sense realism. But most of us don't even know that, right? Our basic philosophy of life comes from something called Scottish common sense realism. Part of which is if this looks like wood, it probably is wood. Okay? That's common sense. We know common sense, but there's an actual philosophy that started in Scotland to express that. And that's most of us. But we have relationships with people, and our dad said, boy, if that looks like wood, it probably is, right? Quit messing around with some of these strange ideas. That stuff influences us probably more than real strict sort of philosophical teaching. And so, here's the example of that. A lot of kids today are growing up with a be yourself and let it go mentality from Disney, right? Disney is influencing the attitudes and life approach and perspective. And they did, by the way, Disney's pretty old. It did for us too, right? So the stories, the movies, that is influential at just as much as the sort of more philosophical ideas. And those philosophical ideas bleed through. A lot of rock stars are philosophers, aren't they, Tom? A lot of rock stars read really serious philosophy and then they sing it. And that's where people learn that philosophy of life. All right, let me keep moving. I'll pause for comments. Go ahead. So his dates are 1792 to 1822. He often fled England because of, number one, his debts and his writings. He could have been arrested for sedition. His writings were so provocative during that day. So he lived in France a lot. Sort of the older version of living in California. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to post this online. So many of you guys know, so I read the Wikipedia biography of him and didn't run across that, but so Wikipedia may be trying to cover over any drug use. He had a lot of hallucinations.
Yeah, it just came up in a literature class I took.
Okay, yeah.
He was pretty cool.
Wouldn't surprise me. He did. His wife wrote Frankenstein. Yeah. Kind of weird. Yeah. And that came to her, that story apparently came to her in a dream, and then she embellished that. So, I'm not quite sure what she took before she went to sleep. So her name is Mary Shelley. She is the author of Frankenstein. Exactly. Yeah, so he died in a shipwreck. He shouldn't have been, it was a boat not really seaworthy enough for the storm that he ran into. And three men died in that shipwreck. One of which was another wacky poet. All right, so now Darwin, Marx, and Freud go together. All right, and again, we can cover this pretty quick. So we all know about Charles Darwin and the origin of species. And here's kind of the logic that goes with that. If you can explain the human race through natural selection and survival of the fittest, which there is no more anti-biblical idea, right? Just want you to know, I'm saying if you have that mentality. I do not, but if you did, if you can explain the human race through natural selection and survival of the fittest, so you don't need a divine creator. Also, there's no special status for the human race, right? We're just no different than the other animals, protozoa, and everything else. Also, humanity and human history has no purpose, so we're starting to take away the end goal for humanity, right? So, what is the chief end of man, somebody? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Can the stars glorify God? Yes, they can. The stars do glorify God, right? The stars can glorify God. Can they enjoy Him? They cannot, right? So the special purpose of humanity is we can both, and that's a summary, of course, of biblical teaching, is we can both glorify God and enjoy Him, all right? So the purpose for humanity is taken away, and therefore you can now create your own purpose. Right? See where this is headed? You can create your own purpose in life. Karl Marx introduces the idea that human history is the history of oppression. He claimed that family, state, and church were tools of the elite to keep the masses in line. Right? So especially the family, especially the church. They are the tools of the elite to keep the masses in line. He's famous for saying religion is the opiate of the masses, right? You know what? I added state in. That's an assumption on my part, and I haven't read the Communist Manifesto in a long time. Maybe I've never read it, I'm not sure. But my suspicion is that he would have included the state, anything structural. You know, where communist Russia ended up is not necessarily where he intended it to go. But I would have to withhold my answer on that one. All right? But that explains the victim mentality of today, right? Right? If everything structural, family, church, state, speed limits, if all of that is even language, right? If all of that is a tool for oppression, then everybody's a victim. Right? You're a victim of your parents, you're a victim of society. So there's a strong victim mentality today. And it also explains why everything is so politicized. You can't bake a cake without it being a political statement, right? You can't run a Boy Scout troop without having to choose, are we going to let girls in? I don't know what the rules are for Boy Scouts anymore, but, you know, and we occasionally get requests. Can our facility be used for a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout event or troop? And saying yes is a statement. Saying no is a statement, right? So everything is politicized. Now let's move to Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, kind of a summary of his long life of teaching, if that's what you can call it, is the sexualization of yourself, or of the self, the sexualization of the self. So, we kind of touched on this a few weeks ago. If sexuality is one of the strongest urges that humans feel, right? So just starting at puberty, there's this very strong attraction, right? If sexuality is one of the strongest urges that humans feel, and remember, we've already established, or these philosophers have already established, that feelings are morality, right? Feelings are morality. Or the only way to understand morality. So feelings determine who we are and what is right, then sexuality begins to equal identity. And that's where we're at today. Also, Freud promoted the idea that sexual urges began in childhood, not at puberty. And remember that children are innocent, right? So these urges are now innocent. They are expression, by definition, of both innocence, and they are part of who you are. It cannot be otherwise because it started at infancy. So are you with me? So therefore, we have the sexualization of the self. That's who you are. And it's right. Whatever you feel in that arena is right, by definition. So that's... Then you take Marx and Freud together, and everybody's a victim if their particular identity is not affirmed. Affirmed. Okay? Let me wrap up a couple things, and we'll have a few minutes for finishing up. So we end up with the kind of the big idea of this book, modern expressive individualism. Expressive individualism, and I quote from this book, "The real identity of an individual is to be found in the inner psychological autobiography." Who writes an autobiography? Yourself, right? So you write the story from how you feel on the inside, and that's who you are. That is your real identity. The authentic individual is the one who behaves outwardly in accordance with the inner psychological nature. This is my own comment. All of this has led to the modern ideal of self-determination, in other words, basic human freedom, very American value, of course, right? You follow me on that? That's a very American. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is enshrined in our founding documents. The modern ideal of self-determination has become the postmodern ideal of self-definition. And woe betide the person in America who says you're not allowed to define yourself because somebody's going to be whipping out pretty soon. Yeah, but our whole nation is built on the idea that everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you're standing in my way. Right? But ultimately, in reality, in the real world, where this looks like wood, so it probably is, in the real world, self-determination is not the same thing as self-definition. Basic human liberty has limits. I cannot be Marie Antoinette. I just can't, no matter how much I identify as Marie Antoinette. Okay, that at one point that got you committed to a mental institution. All right. I've already kind of explained this idea of psychologizing of expression. So go down to where it says example. Example. 100 years ago, if a man told the doctor, I'm a woman born in a man's body, that doctor would say, you've got a problem, and we need to get you some counseling. Okay? Now, if a man says, I'm a woman born in a man's body, he says, we've got a surgery for that. And we've got shots for that. So that is kind of the difference between a traditional, even a society that's not especially religious, or the doctor might not be a Christian, but he was building on a perspective that is more biblical and more reality-based, right? Based on reality, to today, where you define your own reality. I apologize for taking so long. You sort of feel like you need an emotional shower after all of this exposure to some of this trashy lifestyle and false teaching. But we got it over with, okay? and we don't have to return to it. Any comments or questions? Herb. Sure, and we might get to a little bit of that today. So individual expression is very, very important in the church today, right? And it's sort of individualism, being authentic, being true to yourself. That's the vocabulary you can hear in the church. And so we might talk about that a little bit. There's another side of that is generally the church is not very good at getting out in front of things. We don't read philosophers very much. We don't know what's coming at us. And so there's a what was that, And now people are writing books and reacting. But before, we didn't quite know what to think and how do we respond to this? Or we just, hammer away at it. That's wickedness, And it is, but you have to have a more thoughtful response sometimes. Yeah, I mean, almost all of us can remember the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. Right? That's a huge shift, from liberal, philandering Democrat signing the Defense of Marriage Act to Oberfeld under the Supreme Court decision that made gay marriage legal under Obama. It's not very long. Go ahead, Rhonda. Yeah, so somebody know what that's called or what the name of that is? Yes. Yeah. Mhm. Right. Right. Go ahead, Tom. Yeah. That you're wrong. Yeah. Afraid of a higher authority than your own emotions. Yeah. I think so, yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. I don't. I don't worry about that a lot. Um, right. 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 Exactly. Yeah. And now I'm not advertising these videos. Um, they're available. Yeah. And but we've been making those statements for a long time. We have a position statement on the family. We have a position statement on the sanctity of human life. We have a position statement, and that's been out there on the web for a long time, and as well as human sexuality. Go ahead. Right, yeah. so there, we have a new guest with us today, and it's all those things, right? And so we've had those statements out there. It's not new. Now, we're a small church, and we're flying under the radar of most activists, but that may end someday, right? Somebody someday might come in and say, I'm here because I read that stuff, and I'm shutting you down, right? Right, I mean, that's, I've sort of thought, okay, someday the American church may have to be closer to an underground church than ever before. So what happens? I start visiting everybody in their home frequently. We have occasional meetings in Gary's barn, or mine or whatever. I mean, that just is, right, and it's hard. You ask Christians in China, it's not easy. Their church can get bulldozed overnight and them not even know about it. Right, right. Yeah, shameless plug. So I'm finishing up next week, and I hope to have a little more discussion, breathing room for discussion next week. I've got a short, back of the envelope outline. I'll try not to add too much to it, and we can kind of discuss a little bit. But then Tom's going to take over for 3 weeks, the remainder of the month of March, and speak on anxiety in the Christian life. And then I will pick up my next hot topic. Yeah, and that one should be a little shorter. Okay. Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Right, you worked on a psych ward. Yeah. Yeah. Really quick, Rhonda, and then we need to just. Right. It is. Yeah. It has. Yeah. Yeah, I have a ton of respect for biblical counseling in general, and especially there's one organization called CCEF, Christian Counseling and Education Foundation, that has been super, super helpful to me. Like if I'm trying to help someone, I recently gave away a book. I've been giving away these books by Ted Tripp and Paul David Tripp. For a long time, Paul David Tripp worked for CCEF. Biblical counseling. Yeah. All right. Well, we need to be dismissed. Thanks for your discussion. I kind of am sorry that it was a fast-paced, more lecture today, but a little more normal tomorrow or next week.